Well, Happy New Year, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us for this morning's debate on the question, should the US accept China's economic and technology rise? My name is Craig Allen, and I am the president of the US-China Business Council. Today, we will hear from Rob Atkinson, the president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, and Daniel Gros, the former director for the Center for European Policy Studies. The question before us is quite elemental, and it concerns not only US-China bilateral relations. Rather, I would argue that US-China technology relations will have a profound impact on the global technology innovation ecosystem. The question that we're debating today is also very timely. As the United States moves, however fitfully and awkwardly, toward a new administration and perhaps a new Senate, these issues will only grow in importance. Rob Atkinson has been a leader in the US innovation community for many years, and he speaks eloquently on these subjects. And I, for one, have learned very much on the technology issues of the day from Rob, and I very much look forward to his comments today. Daniel also is speaking to us at an auspicious time in the aftermath of an important EU-China investment agreement announced at the end of the year. This agreement is a big deal in my view, and I very much look forward to Daniel's comments on this as well as on the subject at hand. Daniel has spoken eloquently on this subject, and you can find a link to Daniel's recent op-ed in the event description. So this morning's event will no doubt be exciting and illuminating. Now, for our audience today, please refer to the Slido panel under the video on the ITIF website or the Slido link in the YouTube description to ask questions. Now, we have had a pre-debate questionnaire and or poll, and we will have a post-debate questionnaire poll. And at least what I am seeing right now, we have 58 votes, and we are perfectly equal, 50-50 on the debate. Which do you agree with more? The United States and Europe should accept China's technological and economic rise. That's now fallen to 49%. Or should the United States and Europe work to constrain China? That is now at 52%. So this is a little bit of a horse race, and we'll return to this poll follow at the end of the hour. But in the meantime, let's begin our program with Daniel presenting his argument, and then we will look forward to Rob's rebuttal. Audience questions will be taken at the end of the debate. Please put them in the Slido audience Q&A website, and then I will moderate that from there. So to begin, Daniel, please take the floor.
Many thanks, Greg, for hosting this event. It's always a pleasure to have these transatlantic discussions. And I must admit from the outset that the very question already shows the difference between Europe and the US, because no other power, no other state in the world except the United States could even dream about stopping the rise of a major power like China. Now, this is, of course, something which is not just subject to the political whims of individual governments, but the issue we are talking about today regards the fundamental drivers that are behind the rise of China. And here I would submit to you that this has very little to do with direct Chinese policy, let's get strong, let's overtake the United States, but much more to do with the fundamental drivers of Chinese economy and Chinese society, I would add. And these two fundamental drivers are very simple, simply a high rate of savings and a high rate of investment in education. And on both aspects, China is really exceptional. Other countries in Asia have also risen economically very quickly. You all know about Japan after the war, South Korea, Taiwan, and so on. They all had similar ingredients: strong investment, strong savings, and good education systems. But China seems to be a little bit different in the sense that on every front, it does a little bit more than what Japan or South Korea did beforehand. For example, the Chinese savings rate, which is still hovering close to 50% of GDP, has allowed it to create a world-class infrastructure for more than 1 billion people in less than 20 years, something which otherwise would take many generations. And the second aspect on which China has really excelled is in its spread of education. There are two aspects to that. Not too long ago, China had many people who didn't even know how to read and write. Now the entire population goes to high school, and a very high proportion of those who finish high school now actually goes to university. In China now, the proportion of the younger generation, those today 20, 25 years old, that goes to university or to college is as high almost as it is in Europe. Not quite as high as in the United States, but very similar. And many of these people obviously study the traditional what's called STEM, science and technology subjects. And this means that China, given its population, just graduates millions of engineers, technicians, and researchers in many scientific fields. And the quality of this education is also not so bad. Perhaps some of you know of the global comparison that the OECD does of high school students in the 14, 15 years age bracket. And they have found consistently that in the United States, the average is average. Not bad, not much better or worse than other rich countries, but that China excels. As China has one of the best educational systems that one can think of, at least in terms of high school education, comparable in quality to those of other Asian, high-performing Asian countries like Japan and South Korea. So if you take these two elements together, a massive spread of education, most of it good quality, a massive investment spree, which allows the country to have the most modern infrastructure in almost every respect, then you would expect China to advance economically, because after all, how can you not grow when you invest a lot in physical capital and you have workers who are highly educated? And on top of that, you have an economic system which is very open. And of course, this economic growth and this strong basis in terms of scientifically educated people will over time also lead to scientific advances being made in China. Of course, everybody starts by imitating first the others. By the way, the United States did something similar in the 19th century. But I'm convinced that given this very strong base, China over time will also become stronger as an innovator. And that is, again, if you want the raw force of numbers, when you have millions of engineers and technicians and scientists, then it's unlikely that if you just hold back one enterprise like Huawei, that you can hold back an entire economy and an entire ecosystem, which is highly competitive and highly innovative. So for all these reasons, I believe that there are very strong fundamental forces driving Chinese growth, whatever its political system, and as long as the political system does not interfere too much with these very strong fundamentals, China will thrive economically. Now the question is, does it make sense to oppose that rise? Can one do something against that? Of course, the United States could stop trade with China. But the US is 1/4, not even that, of the world economy. If the US doesn't want to trade with China, other people, including Europe, as we see, would presumably take its place. The same thing goes for many areas of investment. If many American companies are no longer allowed to invest in China, then maybe European companies, which might not have quite the same technology, but very similar one, will do it. So I fail to see how the US could actually try to stop the rise of China. It might, of course, create some difficulties in the short run, but in the long run, I very much doubt that the growth rate of China will depend on what the United States does. Perhaps let me stop here, and we can come back later to some other arguments. I think, Rob, the floor is yours now.
Well, Daniel, thank you so much. I really appreciate your comments as well as your willingness to join on a pretty important debate. And also would note I've really enjoyed your work and SEP's work generally over the years. So, and also thank you, Craig. So, you know, as many debates are, there's sort of, I think, agreement on some issues and disagreement on others. And I generally agree with Daniel that there's not a lot we can do to slow down Chinese GDP growth. If they change their model to something else away from sort of predatory innovation mercantilism, you could even argue they might grow faster in terms of GDP growth. So I don't think that's quite the right question. The right question is, can and should we stop, or can and should we slow down Chinese advanced technology growth or advancement? And the answer to that, to me, is absolutely yes. We can and we should. So yeah, China's a developing country. They have advantages, as Daniel talked about, workforce, large market, capital. And so yeah, they're going to grow. The idea that somehow we could keep them at this level is a ridiculous notion. So I agree with that. But I think we can and should say something. We can and should attempt to slow them down with their technology advance, in part because their technology advance comes at the cost of European technology advance and US technology advance. And that's, I think, very clear. We released a report last year that showed that, looking at virtually every scholarly study, has shown that it has hurt innovation outside of Europe. Now, Daniel uses the analogy of an Olympic runner. The runner is going to overtake you in his article that I encourage you to read. And this runner is going to overtake you because they're just better. They're trained better to be faster, all that stuff. And so why should we try to hobble who's obviously a superior athlete to us? We just have to accept that they're faster. I don't think that's the right analogy. I think the right analogy is the U.S. is an Olympic runner. We're doing pretty well. And now we're competing with, if you will, sort of the East Germans, who used to be in the Olympics on steroids. And we're also competing against somebody who has threatened the race timers that if they don't cheat in favor of the Chinese runner, that they're never going to work again. So there, the task is not to hobble our opponent here, but to insist that they play fair. So again, we can and we should insist that China stops its predatory practices. It should play by the rules like everybody else more or less does. And this is not about hampering China's progress per se. It's about limiting their ability to do damage to us in terms of advanced technology and to slow down their advanced technology progress. So, can we do that? Well, sure we can. We tried to constrain the Soviet Union because we saw them as systemic competitors, and we did. And so I think we can do that again, certainly not in the exact same way. Now, Daniel says one of the reasons we can't slow them down is that China's state capitalism is not why China has thrived, but rather its success is through organic factors, which are just unstoppable. Their education system, their savings, and et cetera. And he says, quote, that most successful grand economic plans go with the grain, and given the economy's fundamentals, they would achieve this anyway. This is certainly a fashionable view that this is sort of just market forces at work. But I don't think that really explains the Asian miracles of other countries, nor does it explain China. And to be fair, there's sort of a big split in that. There's a bunch of economists and development experts who would say it's capital accumulation, whether it's human capital or financial capital, that drives the Asian tigers and now drives China. And there are other folks who would say, no, it's more policy. And I'm on that side. For example, Joe Stugwell's excellent book, How Asia Works, he says, quote, neoclassical economists claim that markets are inherently efficient, but history shows that markets are created, which is to say markets are shaped and reshaped by political power. And he talks about that, displacing the landlords in China, focusing on manufacturing export, financial repression. China doesn't have this massive savings rate by chance. It has it because it engages in systemic financial repression. Another good person on this is my longtime hero, Dick Nelson at Columbia. And Dick has written extensively on the Asian miracle, and again argues there's two groups. There's what he calls the accumulation theories, which is, I think, where Daniel's coming from. They accumulate capital, human capital, and others. And there's other that stresses more advancing production functions, including with government support. So when you think about China, does anybody really think that China would have developed an advanced aviation industry as they've done with COMAC without an industrial policy? This has nothing to do with capital accumulation. Nobody in their right mind, no company in their right mind would invest to compete against Airbus and Boeing. It just can't be done unless you are massively subsidized by the government. Does anybody really think China had an inherent advantage in high-speed rail in building it? Actually, in building high-speed rail production capability of firms without forced tech transfer? ITIF has a new report on that. It'll be coming out soon. And it's very clear the Chinese never would have gotten anywhere if they had not forced foreign companies to provide technology transfer. Does anybody really believe that the Chinese would have any kind of semiconductor industry without the massive hundreds of billions of dollars, or at least $100 billion of semiconductor funding? As I wrote in a recent article called Who Lost Lucent, it's pretty clear that Huawei wouldn't exist without the government. In fact, Chairman Ren, the CEO of Huawei, stated as much. He said, without the Chinese government, Huawei wouldn't exist. My final point is that I think Daniel's assumption, although I'll let him respond to that, but generally the assumption in Europe overall is that this is just a commercial competition, and China is just one of many countries that's competing in commercial spaces. And, we can be indifferent to whether the US wins or China wins. I guess I'd ask my European colleagues, and Daniel in particular, do you think the world would be a better or worse place if China were the hegemon and not the US? And I know there's a lot of sort of grumbling and historically about the US being the hegemon, but that role provides enormous global benefit. And I don't think you're going to see that. In fact, I know you won't see that if China becomes the hegemon, which they will if they continue to advance in technology, because they're going to use that for military advantage, financial advantage. We already see that with Uyghur oppression. We see it with how they dealt with Hong Kong. Systematic violation of human rights, their wolf warrior diplomacy, bullying nations, military buildup in the South China Sea. Is that really what we want? I don't think it is. I think what we want is to make sure that the US and Europe and other market-based democracies are strong. And to me, that means we've got to do some things to push back. Let me just say real quickly, is there anything we can do? And by the way, to be clear, I don't say that everything that the US government has done, including in the Trump administration, has been the right thing to do. In fact, I don't agree with that. But that doesn't mean going and doing nothing is also the right alternative. We can continue to limit Chinese FDI in the US, which to me, I think Europe is making a big mistake there. We've done that to some extent. Their FDI is about tech acquisition. It's all it is. It's tech acquisition. It's IP acquisition. We can try to limit forced tech transfer that they engage in. We can limit their IP theft by limiting market access for the companies that have benefited from that. We can work to limit Chinese dominance in standards bodies. We can push back through the WTO and other means through limiting egregious subsidies. We could talk about bringing other nations into the orbit of working together to constrain and pressure China to play by the rules. So there's a lot of things we can do that I think would be useful in pushing back against China. And it would slow them down in terms of their tech advance, and it would help us and Europe advance faster. So thank you.
Let me just say from the outset, and I think here I don't speak only for myself, but for the majority of Europeans, there's a clear answer to the question whether whether Europe wants the US to lose that race. Clear answer is of course not. Everybody prefers a world in which the US remains number one rather than China becoming preponderant. That is quite clear. But one thing is what one prefers, another thing is the trends one sees going on. And you're quite right in pointing out that even if you take an economy which has very strong fundamentals, the government still has a role. You're quite right in saying that if the government decides to invest in commercial airline production, then of course, given all the resources of China, they will be able to produce commercial airliners. Whether they are very good and whether they sell outside China, it's a different issue. Huawei is perhaps one case. You mentioned chip production. The chip production illustrates also the case that the Chinese government is not omniscient. It doesn't know where the best technology, where the best sectors are. It has been, according to different reports, putting hundreds of millions, if not billions, into that sector without much showing for it. So I would say, yes, it's of course true that the Chinese government and governments in Asia have contributed to directing the technological advance to certain sectors. We always look at those sectors where they have succeeded and say, look, this was a success. But our own experience has been that over the long run, governments who don't work with the grain, in the end, only hold their country back. So if I were an American and I wanted to win the economic race, I would say, please, China, increase the role of the state so that state-owned enterprises become more important. We know that the profit rate of state-owned enterprises is 1/3 of that of private ones. So the stronger the government becomes in China, the less China will grow. But as you said, it's not only about the economy, it's also about the technology. And here I would submit again, we can of course try to cut off China, or not, when I say we, not the Europeans, but more the United States, of course, from the latest technology. But exchanging technology, like any trade, always implies a bilateral dependency. If China uses some US technology, and maybe the US uses some Chinese technology, then both are a bit dependent on the other. And that in general makes it easier to manage conflict. It creates, of course, conflicts also, but it makes easier also to manage the relationship over the long run, because both sides have to lose from open conflict. And therefore, my argument would be that the more trade and investment there is between the two sides, the better, not because one side will win, but because there are many small ties which tie down these Gullivers and make sure that they don't wreck the world. And this is also the perspective in which I would see the agreement recently concluded between the EU and China on investment protection, which has a very marginal impact on the ground because Chinese investment in Europe is minimal, and European investment in China is also not that big. But it is perhaps by opening and welcoming within certain limits Chinese investment in Europe, one creates another little tie which binds China to the rest of the world and therefore can moderate its own behavior. This is the perspective, I would say, I think somebody called it engagement in the past. Engagement not to change fundamentally China, that we cannot do, but to give it an interest and a stake in the world economy. Rob, maybe.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Daniel. So, just to respond to a couple of your points, you mentioned Airbus, and I'm pretty confident that COMAC is going to dominate the Chinese passenger jet market, and maybe they won't. Probably won't be selling much in Europe or the US just because their plane isn't going to be good enough. But it'll be good enough for China because virtually every Chinese airline company is state-owned. They'll probably sell in Belt and Road countries as well because of the pressure that they'll put on. So if you think about what does that mean for Airbus? Airbus is a company that relies significantly on sales in China, and it's an industry where there's fairly low marginal costs and high fixed costs, meaning that the more sales they can have, the more innovation they can have, and the better competitive they'll be. So again, to me, I frankly don't know why Europe stands for that. Don't know why we stand for that. It's clearly a WTO violation, and if you think about just that, you take about that as a model in other areas, automobiles, electric vehicles, I think is another case where they're going to dominate. The Germans to me are delusional, frankly, the German car companies, when they think that they're going to continue to have dominant market share in China. I don't think they will in 20 years. The Chinese don't want that. They're going to have Chinese car companies in electric vehicles, and that will give them scale to be, at least penetrate other markets, maybe not Europe and the US, but other markets. You mentioned ship production. I disagree with you on that. They certainly haven't. They've certainly wasted money, but they make progress. If you look at SMIC, their semiconductor firm, they're fifth in the world in semiconductor production. They're on track to get to 14 nanometers. That's not as good as TSMC in Shanghai and in Taiwan, sure, but it's pretty darn good. They don't need to be, that's the whole thing about China. They don't need to be at the cutting edge. They just need to be a fast follower, like Korea did, like Taiwan did early on, and they seem to be able to do that. I think this goes to another key point. Daniel, you mentioned the SOEs don't make as much profit and therefore they're inefficient. Yeah, I 100% agree with that. But I think we're applying US standards of success. The US and European standards of success to some degree are right, which is capital efficiency. So are you wasting money? Do you have total factor productivity? Chinese don't care about that. They just don't care about it. Their goal is not to raise total factor productivity. Their goal is to dominate advanced technology sectors. So the low profit rates of the SOEs are a feature, not a bug. They enable the SOEs to essentially have a subsidy to let them compete with US and foreign European companies. And Daniel, you mentioned sort of, which I think is, your key point is, we want engagement, we want to bind them, if you will. There's a big debate about that in the US. I'm sort of on your side. I'm certainly not on the side of full decoupling. No, by no stretch of the imagination do we support that. And I think one of the big issues with this debate is that the Trump administration, they sort of got the general direction right, if you will. But strategically or tactically, they made a lot of mistakes. And I think we shouldn't sort of let that color what we want to do jointly next in the US and Europe together. So absolutely, we don't want to go back to the Soviet Union where we sell them Pepsi and wheat, and that's about it. We are going to be engaged economically, both of us, with China. And we can't stop that, nor frankly should we stop that. But to say that we should just sort of blithely accept it and not really push back in the key areas where we really both agree that there are violations of the spirit of the WTO, that's where I guess maybe we disagree. I don't know if we do or not, but certainly I would say that is a key area to push back. And if we do that, we will constrain their technology growth.
Okay, terrific. This debate is predicated on a binary statement that we should either accept or constrain. And of course, the world is much more complicated than that. And I suspect, Rob and Daniel, that there's a lot more agreement in between you than disagreement. We've artificially constrained ourselves in a way. So let's talk about areas where we do agree, and perhaps looking at this from U.S.-EU cooperation, either bilateral, Washington with Brussels, or perhaps multilateral would be better, or D10 would be better. What would be ways to approach this problem set from a constructive perspective? And Rob, perhaps we could start with you. What would your proposals be going forward to address some of the issues that you've raised?
Yeah, so my colleague Stephen Ezell and I wrote a piece right before the 2016 election where we laid out a comprehensive strategy or plan to do that, and some happened, but I think that's still a good blueprint, if you will. Look, I think number one, I hope that there's strong transatlantic cooperation here. I think the Biden administration will mend some of the fences that were unfortunately broken, if you will, and hopefully that's there. And what could we do there? Well, I think one thing we could do would be joint agreements around looking at Chinese investment in each of our countries, so that, like, for example, the Chinese tried to buy an American semiconductor company using essentially a shell corporation. It turns out it was Chinese government money. We should work together to make sure we understand all of what that happens and push back against that kind of unfair investment. I think another area, for example, would be to identify, again, jointly, Chinese companies that have gained their advantage largely through stealing European or American IP. There's something, for example, Fujian Hinghua, the DRAM company, they did that. I don't think there's any dispute that they did that. They stole Micron technology. Nobody thinks that's legitimate. We could agree on that and then say any Chinese company that does that, we're going to shut them, we're going to close them off from our markets. Now, to be clear, I'm not talking about shutting off, all the other areas of where China plays by the rules. I'm just saying strategically or surgically, let's look at companies like that and send a very clear message to China. You can't compete that way. I think more joint WTO cases. Everybody talks about, can we do that? I think we can. Secondly, I give Europe credit because they have been pushing for serious WTO reform, frankly, more than we have, although we've been pushing for reform in some areas, working really closely together on WTO reform, particularly in the areas of subsidies. I think that would be something we could all do.
So, Daniel, be grateful for your views on the prospects for transatlantic cooperation here, or perhaps you would prefer a WTO approach. I think you're muted, Daniel.
You will find Europe quite willing to engage on a transatlantic approach. And I think you have seen the paper which has been prepared here in Brussels along those lines. But then, of course, the devil is always in the details. The WTO, for example, could be a joint approach, transatlantic and multilateral. But there's the one glaring issue, which is the dispute settlement, which could be easily resolved if the US agrees to appoint new arbitrators, or it could take a long time. And there, of course, the question comes, what are the fundamental interests of the US? Does it also want to be bound by the WTO rules? It's the experience in the, if you want, a great power competition is always that the great powers, they like multilateral institutions as long as they rule in their favor. But accepting ruling against them is more difficult. And that is easier for the EU, which is a big commercial power, but a small geopolitical player. And so this is the first touchstone, I think. One could do something like this. on banning the sales of Chinese enterprises which have stolen intellectual property, there always we come to the question, how do you prove that? Would you accept only the burden of proof which a US or European court would require? Is it enough to have a company just complaining about it? As we know, even in the US, companies are suing each other every day about accusing each other having stolen their respective intellectual property rights. So I would say we can collaborate on this, but we have to look at the details. And how do we make it that it is in a way that it is acceptable also to the rest of the world? So I think Europe would instinctively prefer something which can be multilateral. And secondly, in a way that we give it a due process. Because if we have, like in the past, just the American president waking up one morning signing, oh, this company is not allowed to sell anymore in the United States, that is A, against multilateral rules, and B, that is not something that Europe could ever sign up to. So I would say, yes, in the direction is the same, but the underlying assumption about how to bind in multilateral institutions, how to make sure that due process is followed, these, I think, might be more difficult to fulfill on the US side.
Craig, could I quickly just respond? So, in theory, I agree with that, Daniel. The problem is the WTO fundamentally was set up for rule of law, Administrative Procedures Act countries. China doesn't write things down. So how do you prosecute the Chinese on forced tech transfer? Because they don't force tech transfer. When you go to China, they'll say, show us the law. They don't need a law. They just force you to do it. And so I think sort of going back to the WTO, well, if the WTO can't handle it, then we as allies are just toothless. I just don't think that works. The WTO is not structurally set up to deal with a country like China, and China knows that, and they take advantage of that. Now, that doesn't mean we couldn't try to make changes in the WTO, and I agree with that. But you talk about dispute settlement. Look, the dispute settlement process doesn't work. China is able to manipulate it. And there's a great law review article by Mark Wu, a Harvard law professor who had been at USTR, who makes that point quite clearly and compellingly. Also, with all due respect, Daniel, I think WTO dispute settlement can work. And I would just point to the Airbus case. I see Europe complaining about that. Here, Europe saying, "Oh, we want the dispute settlement process to work." It's settled. It worked. You have to end your launch aid, and yet Europe is saying, "No, wait a minute, we don't want to do that." Well, if you don't want to do that, where clearly Europe launch aid was unfair, violated the WTO, I don't see where Europe can say we want to have the WTO be the place to do it. So, yes, I agree we can do more on the WTO, but I don't think it's going to be enough. I think at the end of the day, we're going to have to stand together and say, look, the preponderance of evidence, we're not talking about capital punishment of a criminal. The preponderance of evidence is this company stole IP, therefore we're going to stop them. Are we 100% sure? No, we're never going to be 100% sure, but we can be close.
But you see already in the WTO, you mentioned the Airbus case. Europe had always accepted any decisions which were against it, and will continue to do so. And in the case of Airbus, rightly, I think Europe was found to be in breach of WTO obligations, and it got whacked. I totally agree. Then Europe launched a counter case, like in the US, and said, yes, but in the US, the military aid gives very unfair advantage. WTO panel looks at it, says, yes, Europe has a little bit reason as well, and therefore Europe can whack the United States. So, okay, that remains among friends. But as long as we have a process where we both agree, in the end, there's an impartial instance. And that's why for Europe, this is a really touchstone, the dispute settlement. If the US is saying WTO cannot handle China, we are not interested in a dispute settlement or to bring it back on, then I think it will be very difficult to have a common front.
So you're implying there that the WTO, as it now stands, can handle China. Would you agree with that?
I would say that it is a better handle than a purely politically motivated bilateral agreement between the US and the EU to do something about China, which has nothing really binding it in some substantive rules. I'm not saying that it is an ideal mechanism. I won't say that it can really constrain China and become it like a market economy, but I think it is better than the alternative.
So Daniel, in the China-EU investment agreement outline that has been released, I was very pleased to see that SOEs and subsidies are among the areas that are covered. And apparently there's language outlawing forced technology transfer. That's good language. But I was surprised that there was no explicit mention of technology policy, a Chinese technology policy, which is certainly something that USTR had been looking for and continues to look for in the Phase 2 agreement. Is my supposition there correct? How would the EU constrain China's technology policies if they are detrimental to EU interests? And is this an area specifically in the context of, for example, writing out the detailed rules of the EU-China agreement and or the Phase 2 agreement? Is there a space to work together on that?
Now, on Chinese technology policy, the assumption here in Europe is that is for the Chinese to decide. When it gives certain companies an unfair advantage on the market, then we believe that there are the usual trade remedies which exist. But I don't think we should. We don't constrain US technology policy, which we wouldn't even dream of. We have our own, I think, I must admit, lagging technology policy in Europe. But the idea that we could somehow constrain Chinese policy on technology and what sectors they would like to develop seems very fanciful to me. Let me add, if I may, one thing on this forced technology transfer. Any company which goes to China knows that this might happen, right? If they still go there, they have factored that in, right? By getting, and very often actually they get subsidies, or in the past they got cheap land, they got factories, they got cheap infrastructure. And there was, in my view, basically an implicit understanding. We subsidize you a bit, you come, but then basically you transfer the technology. And anyway, no American, no European company is forced to go to China. And that's why I find this forced technology transfer really a red herring.
So if I could respond to those, I think maybe three key points. One is really, I think, and Daniel, I'm glad you kind of elucidated this, because it really, to me, gets to the bottom of the debate, or the core, which is, one is the WTO up to this as currently structured? And I do not believe it is. It simply has not. You know, you've seen at least 15 years of egregious Chinese mercantilism, innovation mercantilism, almost no rulings against the Chinese in this from the WTO, nothing to constrain them whatsoever. So can it do that? I'm open to that. I don't know enough to say whether the WTO process could be politically reformed, whether there's enough political will to do it, particularly China has a veto power. But I'm willing to say that we should try. But I guess we would just disagree. I don't believe the WTO can constrain Chinese unfair practices. For example, export subsidies, domestic subsidies. The regime is not capable of doing that. Second, you say, well, we all do technology policy. And I frankly, I'm sorry, I think that's a red herring. It's not, look, there's no think tank more that supports technology policy than us. question is, where in the process? I mean, there's the OECD, I forget the name of the manual, the Oslo manual, I think, and then there's some Italian phrase, these principles or whatever. And in the OECD, there's a sort of set of technology policies that are legitimate, pre-competitive research, supporting R&D. That's not what the Chinese are doing that, but they're doing something much more egregious. And so to say that somehow either you're completely free market, or if you're doing a little dab of technology policy, you have no moral standing to push back against the Chinese. I don't agree with that. Europe is doing tech policy. A lot of it's super good. I think we can learn from Europe, frankly, in the US. We're doing tech policy. And great. That's very different than what the Chinese are doing. And I think once you cross a certain line, you go beyond that. And then you have the moral and hopefully legal right to push back. Lastly, you mentioned, well, all companies know that they have to transfer technology and they have a choice. It's kind of like the director in The Godfather, who had a choice to put in the Frank Sinatra character in the movie. You know, when the horse head was in his bed, he had no choice. He still could have said no. Companies in China, you've seen The Godfather, not an epic scene where yeah, that's what companies face. There's no American or European CEO who can walk away from the China market if it's relevant to their business. There's none of them. And because the Chinese market is so big, it's so growing, you have to be in China if you want to be a multinational enterprise. And then when you say, well, you know, they get subsidies and therefore they factor that in, well, you know, and they make a choice. First of all, I don't think that choice has been helpful to them, particularly in the last 4 or 5 years. I think the Chinese have ramped up the kind of technology they're requiring to transfer. It used to be you could get away with giving them old stuff. Now it's harder to do that. But secondly, and more importantly, is that may be fine for the company, but it's not fine for the workers. You know, if China is saying, well, come to our market and we'll give you massive subsidies to locate there, maybe the market decision should have been to stay home and employ those workers in Germany or US. But just because the company, my point is, just because the company chooses to do it, it doesn't mean they don't have a gun to their head. When you have a gun to your head, you'll make certain choices that without the gun, you're not going to make.
And there, I must say, I really fundamentally disagree. You can or you cannot go into China. Nobody forces you. And if you think you lose a lot of profits by not going there, and you're doing it anyway, knowing that your technology might be either stolen or forcibly transferred, then you have made the calculation and you still have make a profit. And actually, the numbers show that the profit rate of FDI in China remains very high. The American companies make much higher profits in China. European companies also make much higher profits in China than they make in either the US or Europe. So despite all this technology transfer, forced ones, of course, they would like to have it without, right? They would like to make even more profits. But for the time being, I think the Godfather analogy is completely mistaken. It is still a good deal. And therefore, I think that is their choice.
Well, but look, you have to differentiate between the short-term interest of capitalist companies, who I understand their interest. First of all, they have to be in China. Craig's members have to be in China. If you're the CEO who says, no, I don't like what the Chinese are doing, you're going to be fired. So you don't have a choice. Secondly, we bought into the WTO. We let the Chinese into the WTO. And in the accession agreement, there's this phrase or statement, no forced tech transfer. Did we not really believe that? And we all know that there is forced tech transfer. Third, there's a really good NBER study recently that showed that the forced tech transfer is much worse than we thought it was. And yeah, American and European companies may be making an okay profit now, but that shouldn't be how we evaluate these things. The question is, what's their long-term capability to stay competitive? And there I'm much more worried about that because of forced tech transfer, we're seeding their competitors who ultimately will hurt American and European jobs and profits.
Okay, I think in our capitalist system, we make sure that the interests of the companies and society at large are aligned, the famous Friedman rule of the 1960s. And therefore, we trust that if our companies make decisions based on their private interests, then it is also in the longer term interest of society. Just the question I always have to myself is, why do we complain about forced technology transfer for China, but not for India, let's say? Right? In India, the limitations on foreign direct investment are even stronger. Right? And I don't know what conditions they have. Nobody complains about that. Why? It's just because I come back here to the fundamental forces, is that the Chinese actually have the engineers and the industrial structure to make use of the technology they are either getting forcibly or stealing or whatever, right? Whatever means you think they're using, and can actually be applied. And I think that is very similar to the situation of the United States in the 19th century. We have seen that historically, power which develops because it has the underlying technological and industrial capacity to use the knowledge, but the knowledge is somewhere else. You remember in the UK, I think certain craftsmen were forbidden by the pain of death to emigrate to the United States because British industry feared it would have then competition from across the Atlantic. It didn't work then, it won't work now.
So we have about 10 minutes left. What I would like to propose is that our listeners all please go back to the poll and vote again on the proposition. It will be certainly very interesting to see if minds have been changed. In the meantime, let me try and bundle a number of the questions that have been submitted and basically ask, how does China, the Chinese challenge, le défi chinois, forgive my French, how should that affect industrial policy in the United States and in Europe? And is there scope for collaboration between the United States and Europe on a positive industrial policy as we, in our own way or together, confront or deal with China? Is there scope for collaboration here? And in the meantime, I'd ask all of our listeners over the next few minutes to please fill out the poll. But Rob, why don't you go first on the industrial policy question, and then Daniel, and then we could close right on time.
Sure. So, there's a big debate, just like there's a debate about why did Asia rise, the tigers? Is it markets? Is it more policy? There's a similar debate in Europe and the U.S. What should be the appropriate role in government? Should it be sort of facilitation of legal regimes and background conditions, or should it be more active? I firmly believe it should be more active. I have a piece coming out in the DoD Prism Journal in the next issue in a couple of weeks, arguing that the reason a core reason the U.S. led in technology and continues to lead is because we had the world's greatest national innovation system after World War II. We didn't call it that. It was what's called the hidden developmental state. It was through DoD, through NASA, through NIH and other things. And then we've let that sort of atrophy and wither away, frankly. So I think we need to resurrect that. I think, for example, if you look now with the election, it seems like Senator Schumer might be the majority leader. He was the lead, along with Senator Young from Indiana, Republican, on a thing called the Endless Frontier Act, $100 billion, R&D, core technologies. I absolutely think we need to do that. And if we don't, in that sense, maybe Daniel and I agree that, we should constrain China. But if we don't get our own act together and get better policies domestically, both of us, we're not going to be able to do this. So, the most important part is domestic policy, I would think. And I do think we should cooperate more with Europe in that space.
Rob, so you would support the D10 proposal and active coordination between EU and American industrial policy?
Very much so. Europe, for example, is focusing on a number of areas that we're focusing on. Quantum computing. These technologies are getting so complex, so expensive that China's got a lot of money. I think in our areas, we should be working more closely together. There's certainly other areas, AI. There's certainly a lot of areas where Europe and America could work together. And what I worry about with Brussels, though, is this constant now anti-American, the GAFAs are taking over and, digital sovereignty. Europe's running $160 billion trade deficit with trade surplus with the U.S. and about $1.5 billion trade deficit in digital. It's ridiculous to me. It's like Europe and the U.S. should be working together and stop complaining about the fact that we happen to be good in cloud computing.
Daniel, the view from Brussels?
I happen to agree with Robert on this one. I intensely dislike also this bashing of Google, Facebook, and others. It doesn't really make sense. Again, the devil here is in the detail. I think AI, for example, excellent. We should collaborate. Unfortunately, the Europeans, what are they looking at? At ethical aspects of AI, right? I mean, which is nice, which is necessary, but if that's all you're doing, you don't get very far. If you look at data, and a lot of the new industries are data-driven, right? Here again, we have the problem that there's a fundamental difference. In Europe, data protection is so paramount that even, just to give you an example of the app which was developed in Germany to tell people whether they have met somebody who had coronavirus, it was completely anonymized, so it's basically useless. Right? So even under these dire circumstances, this data protection mantra or dogma cannot be overcome. So my challenge would be for those people like Robert and others to find areas where Europe can actually do something useful, maybe quantum computing, maybe in things where you have actually hardware working with software. I think Europe's pretty much lost on the software part, but combining hardware and software, as we see, for example, in 5G, that's an area where Europe can still contribute and where I could see transatlantic cooperation.
I agree.
Okay. So we have a new poll having received quite different points of views. And I will say that there have been some changes in our audience's perspectives. Currently, 61% of our audience would agree that the United States and Europe should work to constrain China. And 39% would agree that the United States and Europe should accept China's technological and economic rise. Oh, that's just gone down to 38%.
That was me voting.
Oh, let me just offer as a concluding thought that I think that this type of dialogue is super important. The fact of the matter is that Europe and the United States look at China differently, and we have different interests. That the United States is a Pacific power with alliances that are very deep, very important in the Pacific. We have maintained a posture of freedom of navigation within the Pacific for the last 120 years, which has never been, well, was challenged by the Japanese in the 30s. And so our security perceptions are quite different. Nonetheless, that makes it all the more important that we have this type of dialogue, that we continue this type of discussion and explore that area for coordination and collaboration and joint research and joint efforts in areas of mutual concern, which would certainly include China's technology policy, subsidies, state-owned enterprises, and market access issues that we know so well. So, Rob, I thank you for putting this together. Daniel, I thank you for your profound contributions. And Rob, let me turn it over to you and Daniel for any last comment.
Well, I don't have any other than to say thank you to both of you, and thank you to our listeners. I couldn't agree more that this, particularly now with the Biden administration in place, we really do need to get back to having a stronger civil, dialogue between our European friends and partners. And I'm hoping we can continue to do that and have it be productive.
Okay, Daniel, last word.
Same here. I think we can and should work together. We have very similar goals, but we differ, as we in any family, on how we reach them, and we should start a dialogue on that.
Okay, with that, let us adjourn. And special thanks to all in the audience. My sincere apologies to all the wonderful questions and comments that I wasn't able to get to in this short period. But what a wonderful discussion, and I hope that we could carry on in the near future.